Hi folks, thanks for joining me again today. I made a promise in one of my previous videos and now I'm keeping it. This video is about vibrato. As I started working on this, I realized, well, there's a whole lot that goes into this subject, and many different instruments practice it and teach it. And you could spend a whole lot of time studying it. But I'm going to try and condense some information that will be useful to you, hopefully entertaining for you to practice with as you're working on bringing vibrato in to be a natural part of your playing. So what is vibrato? Vibrato is a pulsation in the sound, and it's a very natural thing. Most of us tend to, when we sing, we tend to use some kind of vibrato, but some of us don't. So one of the first things to think about is it natural to you or not? And I think you already know that probably. If you don't have a natural vibrato, it can be quite difficult and frustrating to hear your teacher say over and over again, well, bring some life into the sound, use some vibrato, it should sound like this, and then they'll demonstrate for you. And that's a great way to learn because it's really an oral thing. You're trying to pick this up by ear. Now, I'm going to help you today. I'm going to try and give you some ideas about how it's done, especially if you don't have vibrato. But if you do have a natural vibrato, as I did, and this is a confession here, when I went to school for trumpet, I went to the Oberlin College Conservatory, and I had a natural vibrato. I'd always had it. I never thought about it. It just seemed like a natural thing to do. It fit with a lot of music. But as soon as I got to school, my teacher told me I couldn't do it anymore. To learn how to play without vibrato, and as I may have mentioned before, that was very difficult for me. And the reason is I was using the vibrato to kind of cover some flaws in my playing. So the most essential thing is to make sure when you're practicing vibrato, which we'll get to in a minute, that you start with your most beautiful tone, with your most complete tone. So the voice is very resonant, and you don't lose that when you use the vibrato. And this is all a matter of listening. We'll talk about this as we go along. So there are lots of ways to do vibrato, and that's another reason why I wanted to do this video. So I'm going to start with the common way that I tell people who don't have a natural vibrato to do the vibrato, and that is with the hand. Some people don't like this, but because it has its own particular style and its own particular sound. So I'm just going to play a note and add vibrato to it using the hand. So I hope you can hear that, and I'm going to exaggerate it. So that's a wider vibrato, and you can tell the style is very different. Now, as I go through, you might get some ideas, some flashes might come into your mind when you hear the various styles of vibrato, because what I just played, there's that. You get this really intense, what we now consider an old style vibrato, and keep your mind open to these things. They all fit. It's almost like a different language, or within a language, it's like a different accent or a different dialect. And so the styles of vibrato are really important. But it's also very personal. So if you don't have a vibrato at all, start with the hand, but there are a lot of other ways to do it. You can see that what I was doing is with a very light touch on the instrument, I am changing the pressure of the mouthpiece. That's basically what I'm doing, but very slightly. Now, if your chops are really tight, you have a very thick cushion and your chops are very muscular, you may not be able to get very much of a result with a hand vibrato. So it's very individual, and I'll tell you what I can, but you got to work this stuff out for yourself when it comes right down to it. Okay, if you have a natural vibrato, very likely it's a jaw vibrato. What does that mean? Well, I'll show it to you, and then I'll kind of give you an idea of how you do it. So that is my natural vibrato. And each of these vibratos, each of these ways of doing it, physical ways of doing it, and each of the styles have a different, they have a different musical effect. And so you want to be flexible with this. And what I'm going to recommend for you to do, even though it might seem like a lot of work, if you're a curious person like myself, it'll seem like fun, is go through and try all these different kinds of vibratos. What's another way to do vibrato? With the diaphragm. Now, what does that mean? Most people don't even know where their diaphragm is, what it does, or how it works, or how you do anything with it. And actually you don't. It's an involuntary muscle, but we also have voluntary control over it. So if I do this with my voice, now what's happening is the volume is changing. With the jaw vibrato, depending on how it's done, the timbre is changing. And on any one of these kinds of vibrato, you can also change the pitch at the same time. Wow, this is getting complicated. You see why it took me a while to get around to this, because there's just so much to consider. But remember, this is all a listening exercise. So you want a great example of diaphragmatic vocal vibrato. The famous folk singer John Denver, that's his vibrato. And boy, is it unique. It's the way his voice doesn't sound like any other voice. And it's not just the timbre and the size, the shape of his voice. It's that unique style of vibrato. Now, most singers don't use that kind of vibrato, but you can do it with your voice, and you can do it on the trumpet. And that's a kind of vibrato that I recommend that you try, but not as vibrato. We'll get into this later. This has to do with changing the intensity of the sound, even changing the timbre or the pitch, all with breath control. But to use that kind of breath control for vibrato is not very efficient. Let me put it that way. It's quite difficult. So if that's your natural vibrato, experiment with the other kinds, and maybe you'll discover something very useful. There's another way of vibrato, which is very common among flute players. And many of them don't even know that they're doing this because it's so natural to do it this way. And it is like diaphragm vibrato, but unlike diaphragm vibrato, the breath stays very steady. So that I'm doing with my throat. And I strongly recommend that you not do this on the trumpet. I want you to experiment with it, because what you're going to find is, if you're really paying attention, that it's very possible that you're using that kind of control a lot. It's so natural to do it that way. Many of you, if you can whistle, you see that the pitch is getting, the pulsation is louder and softer. There's no pitch change. Whereas if I do it with the jaw, I lose the vibrato when I whistle, right? Because I'm distorting the aperture. So all these things work together in order to get the kind of result that we're hoping for in the music. What's another kind of vibrato? Yeah, you didn't know there were that many kinds, right? The real problem is a lot of people are doing a little bit of these all together. So you need to sort it out and see if you can do one at a time. The last kind of vibrato I'm going to mention today is lip vibrato. Basically, that's a tightening or a loosening, both. A tightening and a relaxation at the aperture. And And that vibrato is not uncommon among mariachi players. It's kind of part of the culture. And again, I'm going to tell you, where does that come from? It comes from hearing people doing it and then working to figure out how to get that sound, because there's a special kind of sound to that vibrato. So all of these have assets and liabilities. There are things that they're good for, things that are things about them that are easier to do or more difficult to do. So you want to keep it simple, but you have to experiment in order to find out kind of where you come down in terms of what's going to work best for you. Now, what are the main things? How do you practice this? The main thing is you have to listen to your sound. So you notice every single time I started, I'm always starting with a full resonant tone, and I'm trying to get that quality that I like in the voice. And if you don't do that, if you don't maintain that all the way through, you can be working on all these things and just kind of messing yourself up. So if I use a hand vibrato on that, just like Harry James, there's an intensity and a focus in the sound that's there all the time. And the vibrato does not disturb that. I'm not sacrificing the sound for the vibrato. And that's the main thing. Don't sacrifice your sound for anything. What to listen for? There's a sweet spot in the sound, as I just mentioned. And the vibrato should become part of the tone and not impede the tone. Now there I started to use a pitch vibrato. So what about that? Well, that's a perfectly legitimate way of using vibrato. But if you do a pitch vibrato, then I strongly recommend that the vibrato, the change in the pitch, is around the center of the note, almost in the note, in the tone itself, not something that's below the pitch center or above the pitch center. So if you want, see, I'm doing a diaphragm vibrato and I'm going above the pitch. That's pretty unnatural. I don't like it. I don't think I'm going to do it anymore. That was yucky. How about a vibrato that drops below the pitch? I find that kind of offensive as well. So there's a place for these sounds, but they might be more if you were doing something making fun of something, if you're doing a caricature, if you're doing something cartoonish or bizarre, then maybe those sounds will come in handy. So this is why I love to experiment. It's like, there's a use for this color, for this texture. I wonder when it'll come up. But what most of us want to do is major in the majors, which is like find something that works for you and that it can become a natural part of your sound without detracting from the quality of the sound. Okay, it's an expressive tool. Changes in the vibrato are not just changes in pitch. As I mentioned, there are also changes in timbre and the changes in volume. And they can be all three of those at the same time. So I want you to listen. That's the main thing. You got to be listening for these things. The main thing I'll tell you to avoid is try not to use a constant, unvarying vibrato. And there are styles in which this works. If you play a lyrical tune that's like in the British brass band style, which has a particularly unique vibrato. You see what I'm doing? Mess around. It's fun. See what you can do with it. But always listen to that core in the sound. That's the key. I'll keep on telling you that over and over again. You have to give the impression that the sound is continuously radiating, and it's not being impeded. It's not being squeezed at all. And this is a very easy thing to do with a lot of kinds of vibrato. Keep on imagining that sound, and don't lose it when you use the vibrato. Okay. I think when you have a good sound and you have a way of doing vibrato that seems to work, if not being completely natural at this point, then what I'm going to suggest that you do is practice changing the amplitude and the volume. And a good way to do this is you put a metronome on. Okay, so you have a tempo. I just went internal with that, so now I have that internal tempo. Now, I'm doing that in a way that I would do it a lot. I'm doing it in kind of a subtle manner. So I hope you can hear it. I'll be interested to listen to the recording to see how well that comes across. Now you see that's a regular timing. Da, 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 da. There's your pulse. And that's good. You want that. But I'll give you an example of how you want to be listening for expressive vibrato. If I crescendo or decrescendo, now what I did is I kept the frequency of the vibrato, the timing, the number of pulses per count, right? If you did 60 seconds on the clock, or on the metronome, then the number of pulses within that 1 second beat. I kept that the same, but I decreased the amplitude. So the amplitude is the size, the prominence of the vibrato, how big the waves are. So I started pretty big waves. And as I diminuendoed, the intensity of the vibrato followed the intensity of the dynamic. That's not a rule, but it's a basic principle. And I think if you listen for it, you'll notice that that really accomplished musicians, that's kind of what they do most of the time. It just makes sense, because vibrato is another way of conveying energy and a sense of movement, a sense of direction in the music. So I'm gonna. Oh, I forgot to close those blinds over there, so I'm getting a little flash off the cars as they go by. Sorry if that's distracting. It is to me, but you know, let's get on with this video. Okay, there's different kinds of vibrato. Here's a, let's see if I'm playing this in the right key. El Salón Mexico. Now that's kind of humorous, and it's very affected. You know, it's a wide variety. I could do it a lot of different ways. Now I did that with a jaw. You see that one? I did with a hand, and you see how the character of it is different. It's a little bit less polite, in a sense. Very cool. This is fun stuff to play with. Now there are many, many different styles, of course. What's another one? Oh yeah, American in Paris, the famous romantic solo. Play around with that one. And this is a great example of how the vibrato has to track with the intensity, because you're just sustaining this note for a long time, and the sense of moving someplace, you're anticipating what's going to happen next. There's another interesting thing in that particular lick, because in pop singing, it's very common, listen for it, it's very common to hear a straight tone and then the vibrato come in after the note's been established. And I kind of did that instinctively on the last note. Kind of strange, huh? It's funny how those things work. Okay, what's another style? Kind of a vocal style. And a lot of times this is quite subtle. So I'm going to play a couple of things. How about post horn solo from Mahler 3. Now you'll notice there the vibrato is very subtle, and that's probably one of the most important things to practice, because a subtle vibrato can be used in so many ways in the orchestra to enhance the life in the sound. I'll give you an example. In a lot of orchestral literature, you don't really need to use vibrato, and maybe it's even inappropriate. But there are some times where if you use a very subtle vibrato, it can really enhance what's happening with the music. So there's the famous chorale. It's a little trio of trumpets in the Brahms Academic Festival Overture, and the little melody that you probably know. Okay, if I'm playing these in the wrong keys, please forgive me, because I'm just playing by ear, off the top of my head. I hope they're the right keys. But don't hold me to that. So normally in a chorale style, you're going to play without vibrato. And the reason is you got three instruments that are playing together. And when those instruments are not using vibrato, it's very much easier to hear the pitch and to hear when those pitches kind of lock together. And it should be beautiful in this kind of traditional harmonic context. It's easier to hear that. But if you use a little vibrato, I hope you can hear that the vibrato is in the tone and it's not affecting the pitch. As a matter of fact, a way you can test this is put your tuner on it and see what happens to the pitch indication. Is the pitch actually varying it, or is it not? And with that kind of vibrato I just used, which is very, very useful for the orchestra, you can put a tuner on it and the note doesn't vary. The pitch of the note doesn't vary. It's only the timbre and to some extent the volume, the intensity of the note. And that's where you get this vibrato effect. Okay, one more. I got yelled at once for using vibrato, more than once, actually. And I know a very famous trumpet player who lost his opportunity to play principal trumpet in a very good orchestra because of his vibrato. And he was also incredibly well loved for his vibrato because it was so personal, so unique. That's why he didn't get the job, which is quite interesting. James Galway, a great flutist who has a very unique and individual vibrato, we dropped him down in the middle of the Berlin Philharmonic, which he played in for a while, and he just, to my ear, he just kind of sticks out of the orchestra. Why? That vibrato is calling so much attention to itself. It's so intense. You know, this kind of what sometimes people call a nanny goat vibrato. I'm not cutting down Mr. Galway's vibrato. I think it's beautiful and I think it's appropriate, but it's very personal. You see, he's a soloist. It draws attention to himself, not to the whole of what's happening in the orchestra. So it's nice to be able to do that. But in this case, I got yelled at by my teacher, who was at that time Mr. Herseth, the famous principal trumpet of the Chicago Symphony back in the day, as they say. And I was playing Leonore. So I started the piece. Can you hear the vibrato? And immediately he yelled at me. I played the first note and says, no vibrato, no vibrato. And I go, whoa. But it was just a reminder from when I had been in school, my undergraduate work, and my teacher said, no, you got to learn how to play without vibrato. Well, he knew what he was talking about. So in order to do this, etc., etc. You see those long notes, the stability of the pitch and the timbre and the sound, and the flexibility of the dynamic is what makes that work. Do you hear that's one long gesture? It's not like a car horn. But what this does is, instead of expressing using the vibrato, I'm expressing using a dynamic change. I'm not really changing the timbre all that much, although that kind of follows. But you see the idea? So there is a place for no vibrato. So if you don't have a natural one, don't worry. Just have fun experimenting with it. I hope I've given you plenty of thought as you go and do your work. Enjoy the process and enjoy listening to people that bring a wonderful sense of that natural vocal vibration in the sound that we call vibrato. Great. I'll see you later on. Have a great day. Bye-bye.